everyone. On today's podcast, we're going to talk with Priscilla and Nathan Layman about how the evidence-based childbirth class prepared them for a home birth and their unexpected hospital transfer after the birth for their newborn. Welcome to the Evidence-Based Birth Podcast. My name is Rebecca Decker, and I'm a nurse with my PhD and the founder of Evidence-Based Birth. Join me each week as we work together to get evidence-based information into the hands of families and professionals around the world. As a reminder, this information is not medical advice. See ebbirth.com/disclaimer for more details. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Evidence-Based Birth Podcast. My name is Rebecca Decker, pronouns she, her, and I will be your host for today's episode. Today, I'm so excited to welcome some graduates of our EBB Childbirth Class. But before we get started, I want to let you know there's a content note on discussion of emergency transfer to the hospital for low oxygen state in a newborn, as well as respiratory support for an infant in a neonatal intensive care stay. If there are any other detailed content notes, we'll post them in the description or show notes that go along with this episode. And now I'd like to introduce our honored guests, Priscilla and Nathan Layman. Priscilla, pronouns she, her, and Nathan, who sometimes goes by Peter, pronouns he, him, are happy parents who live and work in the San Antonio, Texas area. Nathan is a pipeline engineer with Atmos International, and Priscilla splits her time between caring for their 19-month-old daughter and providing part-time telehealth and psychotherapy services through Marker Learning and Octave Behavioral Health as a licensed clinical psychologist. Priscilla and Nathan are graduates of the Evidence-Based Birth Childbirth Class with EBB instructor Leanne Getch. Nathan and Priscilla, welcome to the Evidence-Based Birth Podcast.
Thank you. We're glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So I know your baby is a toddler now, but take me back to your pregnancy and let us know, how did you find out about evidence-based birth?
You want to take this one?
Sure. We knew kind of off the bat that we were going to be going with a midwife. And so when we were meeting with our midwife, she recommended that we get some kind of education and training and listed a wide range of options, and evidence-based birth was one of them. And so we, after looking at the different ones, decided that evidence-based birth was the kind of training that we were looking for in our preparation for the birthing process.
And Priscilla, were you both already planning a home birth at that point, or did you change your mind later on?
Yes, we were planning a home birth at that time, but I had siblings who had done home birth and then one sibling who'd had several births in the hospital. And so I wanted to make sure that we had education that covered both options in case we needed to change that plan. And that was one of the things I really appreciated about EBB, was that there was this kind of no assumptions about where your birth location would be and really trying to educate you on all of your resources.
And what made you decide to go with a home birth midwife with your first baby?
Yeah. So there were a lot of factors, as it is, I'm sure, for most people making a decision about their birth, but I was a home birth baby. My mom had all of my sisters and I at home in the 90s when it was not particularly popular. And several of my sisters had already had home births successfully, including with their first children. And so I think had some confidence that my body was going to be able to be successful in doing a vaginal birth. And then I really wanted the close interpersonal relationship that midwifery care provides, because I had a history of depression and wanted to have that kind of interpersonal relationship to support me, not only during the pregnancy, but through the postpartum period as well. And yeah, just having the freedom to be able to move around, eat, do all the things without a whole lot of pressure from a hospital setting to conform to a certain type of care.
Mm-hmm. So it was a normal part of your kind of family background.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
Nathan, what about you?
No, I knew very little to nothing about the birthing process, nothing about home births, nothing about hospital births. I had sisters who had had children before, but I wasn't really part of that process. And so I'm the youngest child in my family too. So it was kind of all a new educational experience for me. And I was willing to defer to Priscilla's preferences and be willing to support her in kind of this desire to have a home birth.
Mm-hmm. What was your experience like taking the EBB childbirth class then?
For me, it was exactly kind of what I needed to know. Basically, every step of the way, all the different options that could happen, the kind of the positive ways things could go and the negative ways things could go. I think it was particularly helpful hearing about a lot of the research studies that was done for me to kind of get a perspective outside of just anecdotal stories, which I had heard lots of anecdotal stories, lots of kind of, this is what I experienced from Priscilla's family, but I hadn't really heard much about kind of the wider range of research that surrounded home births. And so that was really useful for me to kind of get a real grasp on kind of what the situation was.
Yeah, that reminds me. So there is a module in the EBB Childbirth class where we kind of talk about the statistics on home birth. And so you were able to kind of get a broad overview of the safety through that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Priscilla, what about you? Is there anything that you felt like better prepared for as a result of taking the class?
Yeah, I think the EBB class really lowered my anxiety about the possibility that we might have a transfer and how we could self-advocate in the hospital environment, ideas about what the pros and cons of different interventions were. I think I actually came from like a fear-based hospital perspective in my family culture. And so I think going through the class helped me to be like, okay, these are, yeah, they have pros and cons, and yeah, there's risks with them, but they also can be life-saving, and they can also be really valuable. And so it helped reduce my anxiety and help me to feel more open to whatever birth came, right? Whatever we ended up having. And that actually played a lot into our story later on.
Okay.
Even though it wasn't as personally related to me.
Yeah. That's interesting. So you have more of a fear of hospitals in general. Okay.
Yeah.
And maybe we'll get more into this later, but were there some of the self-advocacy tools that you just like felt like, okay, I can do this if I had to transfer? Like what were some of the techniques that you felt really good about learning?
Yeah. I mean, I think the awareness that like we could take our midwife on speakerphone with us, kind of thing, even because this was during COVID, our daughter was born. And so even if our midwife wasn't able to be in the room with us, we could have her there to kind of explain, here's what happened, here's what's going on, here's why we transferred. And I think the sections where it helped support Nathan in what his role would be as an advocate was also really helpful for me, of being like, okay, it's not going to be all on me. Like, he's educated, he has what he needs to know to be able to say, this is what we are open to, to ask about risks and benefits in the room, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think the skills that I found useful in our hospital stay, as well as during the midwife birthing, was knowing that Priscilla's preferences aren't just a matter of convenience, but they're a matter of kind of her well-being, and having the confidence to kind of listen to hearing what she says and be able to repeat that and be able to press that, and knowing that that is something that there is some value in being able to receive. The other bit that I think was also really useful was humanizing effort of all the healthcare workers, and then be able to see them as people who have their own lives. We did experience some practice of sharing cookies and try to kind of have some personal connection with some of our healthcare providers when we were in the hospital setting. And we found that to be really, really useful for being able to, for advocacy, and as well as just our general kind of comfort in the hospital setting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really is a lot about that interpersonal connection and building those bridges. Because I think a lot of people, if they have to transfer to the hospital or they have some kind of unexpected hospital stay, you're really focused like on you and your body and what's happening to you. And sometimes we forget that the people in the room taking care of you are human beings also. And if you build that connection, sometimes it shouldn't be this way, but sometimes you get better care as a result. It's kind of like a win-win. You get to know them and care for them, and then they care for you as well. So yeah. So you were planning a home birth with a midwife. Was there anything else you were hoping to have at this birth? Like any other preferences for your laboring time?
Yeah, I was really looking forward to being able to use water as a coping method. And so we had a birthing tub that we used several times during labor to help with pain management. And we ended up having the actual birth in the water, having a water birth, which our midwife was kind of like, yeah, we might be able to do that. We might not. It just kind of depends on how things go. And so that was kind of a mild preference. Like, I would like to be able to do that because I've heard from others anecdotally that can help with the discomfort of actual pushing and the kind of laboring at that point. So that was something else we were looking forward to, or I was hoping would be helpful.
Mm-hmm. So you had a tub in the house, like ready to inflate?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. And so share your birth story with us. How did it begin?
So I had prodromal labor. So it actually started at least a week before the official active labor started. So pretty intense contractions that were intermittent, particularly towards the late evening. And so every evening I was like, okay, maybe this is it, or maybe this is it. And so there was a lot of kind of waiting and recognizing and thinking and counting, doing, contraction counting. But then when it actually did start, it very quickly accelerated to being pretty intense. So my mom was kind of an informal doula for us. Our daughter was her 12th grandkid, and she's been at all of the births, and she had 5 of her own births. And so she had some kind of informal support that she was bringing. So she came pretty early on, and it ended up being about 32 hours of labor. And again, starting pretty intense 4 hours in. Like, I had my mom fooled. She thought I was in transition 4 hours in, and I didn't have the baby for another 26 hours.
That was intense.
Yeah, it was pretty intense. Yeah. And our midwife's assistant came out several times to check me and to kind of give us some feedback on where I was at and how things were going. And then the midwife came maybe 8 or 9 hours in. I don't remember exactly. Do you remember?
Going back to your prodromal labor, for our listeners who maybe are first time expecting parents, they don't know what that is. Can you kind of explain? I know you said they were intense contractions that were intermittent. What did it feel like to have that for a week?
Yeah. So Braxton Hicks, I know, are super common, and those will be like kind of those practice contractions, but those tend to be like, you can keep going about your day and everything's normal, right?
It's kind of like a tightening. It can feel intense, but it's just like a tight feeling.
Right. So this would be like, ooh, I have to breathe through them, like intense or a little bit more intense, and very similar to what my first hour or two of labor were actually like, the contractions that I had. So that started about a week in advance, and they would be for maybe 45 seconds to 65 seconds long, and maybe 3 to 5 minutes apart for maybe an hour or a little bit over an hour. And then eventually they would just kind of dwindle away. And so it was like, okay, well, that wasn't it, So it was actually difficult for me to discern from what I was reading. Like, this is sounding like I'm in early labor, but it didn't progress. It didn't actually continue on. There wasn't that gradually increasing in frequency and duration in terms of the actual contractions. It was pretty emotionally exhausting because I'm somebody who's super attuned to my body. And so I was basically having to say, like, this isn't it. I'm going to kind of try to ignore it and go about my day, even though it's uncomfortable, even though it's like, well, is this the day? Because, after 3 or 4 days of this, I'm recognizing this isn't my labor. This isn't what labor is going to look like for me. And so I have to start ignoring it. So I think it was more emotionally difficult than physically difficult. It was uncomfortable, but So.
Yeah, that constant, you don't know if this is it, and should I stop everything and get ready to have a baby? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Nathan, what about you for that week? Were your emotions on edge too?
I think there was definitely some anxiety of, when is this going to happen? Are we not doing enough? Are we going to need to do some kind of natural induction method? I think there was a lot of research. I know there was a section in the EBB Birth about some natural induction methods as well. I think we re-listened to that podcast over and over again, trying to think about it. So I think my mind was just like, is this ever actually going to come? And I think I was concerned about Priscilla and concerned about kind of what was going to be happening. I think these contractions kind of heightened that for me rather than decrease that, because it's kind of like, why is it never progressing? And so,
and how many weeks were you at this point, Priscilla?
40. So it started right around my due date, and we delivered one day after. I was 41 in a day when she was actually born. So I was full term, so it wasn't like there was anything. We weren't like at 37 weeks, like, oh, this is going to be too soon.
Yeah. You were hoping that you wanted labor to start at this point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And how did you tell the difference? Like the day you went into active labor, how did you know?
It just didn't stop after an hour and a half. It kept going. And so then it was and the intensity increased even more than it had been. So the actual pressure of the contractions was stronger. It lasted longer. I had more difficulty focusing on what was going on around me. So that was kind of...
Yeah, that evening, I remember just as we were about to go to bed, we weren't certain that you were going into active labor.
Right.
She even had like a late night snack kind of thing right before you went to bed. And we weren't expecting it, but kind of within an hour of actually trying to go to bed, it was really clear, like, this is really different and this is much more intense, and you can't lay down and kind of rest it out.
Okay. So it was game time.
Yeah.
So you said about 8 hours in, your midwife arrived?
So she came up maybe around 3 a.m, and then at 5 a.m, and then
the assistant. Yeah.
the assistant came to
Assistant,
check on
okay.
me. And then they both came once I got to, I don't remember, maybe 5 centimeters.
Yeah.
4 or 5
I would
centimeters.
say it was more like 15, 16 hours. Because
Oh,
it was
okay.
basically the following afternoon.
Oh, they
when
following
she
up.
arrived.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was in a bit of a haze, so
Yeah.
he remembers the number better than I do.
We did that first night, kind of just you and I and your mom.
Yeah.
And then kind of most of the morning, and then in the afternoon she arrived, right
Okay.
around 1 or 2
Okay.
in the morning.
It also was a rainy day that day. There was a lot of rain, and so it was kind of dark outside. So it was just like this 30-hour dark haze. So it was hard to tell when it was morning and when it was
what time
evening.
of day it was.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, time was blurring.
Yeah.
So what happened that afternoon?
Yeah, the afternoon, to me, it was more of the same, just like kind of intense. Like, when is this going to end? Is it progressing? It feels like I'm further along than I am, and nothing,
Yeah, a couple of bits that were present during kind of this longer time of waiting was a lot of struggle with pain management.
Yeah.
I think that was something that we thought we had a few techniques down for. We had, learned about different kind of, presses and massages and things like that. I think I had some ideas of, maybe we'll be able to distract Priscilla from a lot of the pain with like different kind of TV or movie or music. And really, it was at a level where like anything like that just kind of added to her stress. And so
Right.
Another level I think that was challenging too is because Priscilla's father is immunocompromised, we had some concerns with proximity of Priscilla's mother with the midwife, who had kind of a different vaccination status than her mother. And so because of that, I think there was maybe not as much time that the assistant was spending with us. And so it was really just myself, Priscilla's mom, and Priscilla, and trying to figure out how to endure. I mean, we basically were kind of holding Priscilla's hand kind of through the night, kind of trying to help her handle the challenges. And yeah, I think that was particularly challenging because I don't think I was aware of kind of how long of a marathon it would be, and kind of the fact that like there was, it was mostly just trying to kind of comfort Priscilla as she was experiencing a lot of those pains through the night. So I would say that first night was probably the worst part of the pregnancy for me, or the birthing process for me, because of both the kind of like loneliness of just like it's me and her mom with Priscilla and not having as much of the assistant or the midwife there. And then also I think just the pain of what you were experiencing, and then also just feeling like you just weren't far. Every time the assistant came and checked you, it was just like you're nowhere close. And so I think that was I think really hard, whereas like it felt like this pain that you were experiencing wasn't really yielding any progress, and it was yielding progress, but it was very slow.
And that was not a part of my family story. Like none of the other home births had been like that. They'd all been pretty fast. There had been some intensity, but nothing quite this long. And so I just did not go into it with that mindset at all. Our resources were not sufficient to help me kind of manage the pain to the level that I would have preferred, and that I think we were expecting. Water did help some. We did some essential oils for calming and for the nausea that occurred at different points. I had difficulty eating and drinking, so we did try some of that, but it was kind of like, please get that out of my face. So it was a challenge for sure to kind of endure that. Sometime in the evening, I did make some good progress, and we thought we were ready to push. And the assistant was in the room and was like, yeah, you can try pushing if you want to. The midwife had gone to go rest because it had been a long time. And so I was attempting to push for some period of time. And it wasn't until later that we found out that I was actually only at 8 at that point. Like my body wasn't ready yet. And so then that caused some confusion as well. So we just had some misses in terms of communication and trying to figure that out, even though we had the golden ticket birth team, right? Like, so I think it's helpful, like even thinking back, like we had a lot of the resources that we needed. We had done a lot of the work ahead of times, and yet there's still curveballs in birth, and you can't predict exactly how it's going to go. And I think in hindsight, we probably would have asked for more from our midwife. Like, can you give us some more resources? Like, I might look like I'm doing the normal thing, but I'm not feeling okay with what's going on. So I think that's some of the things we've talked about kind of in hindsight that would have been helpful to us.
Reminds me a little bit of people giving birth in hospitals around that same time. I think people were trying to minimize exposure to other people, and so you wouldn't have as much hands-on support. Was there any mention of the baby's position? Was the baby in a less than ideal position?
No, everything was good. Baby was rotated the right direction, was in a good position. There had been no real concerns leading up to the birth about positioning. So there wasn't anything that would have made it stall out or made it take that long. And, from their tracking, both our midwife said during the birth and after the fact that we were going at an appropriate pace. We were on the slower end, but it wasn't like we ever truly stalled.
Yeah.
It was more intense.
Just a long, slow progress.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And when did you finally get to be completely dilated then?
So she ended up having to break my water because at some point, maybe 4 or 5 hours before Phoebe was born, we were at a point where I was kind of like, I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. And so we were.
This is the night of the second day, roughly the time. So you're like,
24 hours in.
Yeah, 8 or 9 p.m. kind of of the second day. Yeah.
Yeah. So we started talking about, okay, well, what are our options? Do we want to transfer to the hospital so that I can get, some kind of pain reduction so maybe I can rest and maybe then I'll have the energy to get through the rest of this, or do we want to keep trying at home? What can we do to kind of move things forward? And she was like, one thing we can try is we can try breaking your water and seeing if that kind of gives you the extra nudge you need to make it the rest of the way. And so we ended up doing that, which was very uncomfortable and definitely made the contractions more intense. The pressure of Phoebe dropping, because I think my waters was kind of preventing her head from fully engaging with the cervix.
Putting pressure on the cervix, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so once my waters were broken, she was able to engage a little bit better and help me dilate the rest of the way. And then after that, some period of time, I got back in the birthing tub and was there through her birth at that point. So that kind of, and I really, once she gave me the option of like, you can go to the hospital, like you have the resources, we can make this happen. It won't be an emergency transfer because there's nothing emergent going on. Baby's fine. Your body is progressing the way it should. But if you're tired and done, you don't have to keep doing this. And I think her giving me permission in that way, that gave me a sense of like, okay, so what do I really want? And I was able to realize like my values are, I would really like to have her at home if possible. So let me keep trying a little bit longer. And that kind of got me through the last stretch.
Like just even knowing you had the choice.
Yes.
And then you could choose what you wanted.
Absolutely. That made a big difference for me emotionally anyways. And I think at this point too, I had gotten to a little bit finally of a rhythm and through the contractions. And so it was, I don't know. I think I was working with them maybe a little bit more at that point than I was early on.
You weren't fighting it, maybe?
Yeah.
Can I add a perspective on this? So I think maybe Priscilla and the midwife was having one conversation. I actually felt like I was having another conversation with the midwife at this time, which was about whether or not Priscilla was going to reach exhaustion and whether or not she was going to get into a place of danger. And so I was asking her, like, at what point do we have to transfer her to the hospital? Not because she can't handle pain anymore, but because her body can't handle this and she'd have to go into emergency C-section. I think that there was some concern that what would happen if she just couldn't push anymore. And so this is after broke the water, after you started being in the birthing pool. Things weren't still going quite as fast as we were hoping. And so we started setting kind of time goals for ourselves, saying like, let's see where Priscilla's at in like 2 hours. And so we had a clock. And when the clock kind of got to this place, kind of asked, depending on kind of where we were at that point, then we kind of revisited the discussion. And I think it made me feel really safe and secure that the midwife kind of made clear that if there was any point where we're going to approach that risk, that she would kind of notify us and we would just go to the hospital if we were anywhere close to that, but that we weren't right now, and that she thought Priscilla still had a little more food in her, or a little more energy in her to be able to handle it. And so we were able, once we kind of got to some of those points on the clock, we were able to kind of determine Priscilla had progressed like really far, and kind of it was like up to Priscilla's choice at that point as well.
Yeah, I think you're right that in that 2 hour window when they checked me that next time, I was fully dilated, like she was like, okay, we're in the final stretch here, like you can do this. So that was really helpful to kind of like, okay, we made it, or at least we're really close.
You made it through the longest part.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah, I think it's good for our listeners to remember, especially those who might be thinking about a home birth or planning home birth, that it is the number one reason for transfer during labor is for first-time parents who are exhausted or just needing medical pain management. And that's perfectly normal and acceptable reason
Absolutely.
to transfer if you choose to.
Yeah.
At the same time, you felt like you had enough reserves to keep going a little bit longer. So what happened next once you reached 10 centimeters?
That was the fun part.
Yeah, that was, I started pushing. It did take a while. I remember at some point the assistant was helping me to identify what muscles to use by manually engaging and interacting with me. So at some point she said something like, oh no, I remember. She was like, the head's out. And I remember it being like, can you just pull the rest of this out? I'm so done. Can you just, and she's like, no, we can't do that. That's like increase your risks of tearing, and like baby needs to come out with you pushing. But that's one point that like stood out in my memory, just like ready to be done.
Yeah, I think it was actually a really special time. It was really kind of the point where it felt less like I just need Priscilla to survive this to we're going to do this together. So I got in the tub with Priscilla and we started getting kind of in a rhythm of pushing and resting. And I don't know if I actually like developed bruises, but there were like certain parts of like my neck that you would just kind of hold and squeeze and kind of press against my forehead.
We were like forehead.
Yeah, it was a little intense, but it was one of those things where I felt like I am part of this process, and it was actually a really meaningful part of the experience to feel like I'm being leveraged to help push. That was really special.
Yeah, I think it very much felt like we were a team, and he was. There was no like yelling at him or anything like that. Like I really felt like he was the support to me in the process. So
he was there, right there with you.
Yeah,
yeah,
and all the mess.
Yeah. So how long did you push for?
I don't know, hour and a half.
It was longer than I wanted, but less than
the rest of it.
Everything else. Yeah, I think it was in less than 2 hours.
Yeah,
I don't know. I don't know exactly what it was.
I'd have to look back at my birth record.
I think my vague, cloudy memory was like the clock was getting close to midnight when you finally were starting to push, and then roughly around like 1:30, 2 or something like that. She was born. So
yeah.
One of the special things about her birth is that we had chosen not to find out her gender at her 20-week
ultrasound.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Ultrasound. So we actually got to find out at her birth that Phoebe was Phoebe and not the boy's name that we had picked out. So that was really special. And I think I was anticipating that somebody else besides me would be announcing it. But she ended up coming to me on my chest and nobody had figured out yet. So I held her up and was like, it's a girl. So
I was so tired I couldn't even tell. I'm like, is there something in there? We had the lights dimmed. Just like, I can't tell. Like, you tell me. You tell me.
Yeah. So that was pretty fun.
Mm-hmm. So it was the lights were dim in the room and you pushed your baby out underwater.
She was underwater. Yeah. So they she had a double nuchal cord. So they actually had to untie her under the water in order to bring her up to my chest. So she was underwater for a little bit of time, but not very long. And from what we understand, that there wasn't any risk because they don't take breath until they're out of the water. So yeah, to our knowledge, everything was fine with that. But
to me, it felt like it was very quickly that she untangled her and brought her up. I was pretty impressed by that rope work the midwife was doing.
And then what did it feel like to have her on your chest?
Oh, it's such a relief and so much joy and like, we're done. We're finally done. Like we did it. All of this time laboring and she's safe. She's here. I think I had a little bit of anxiety because she was a little bit gray, not blue, little bluish. Like she wasn't the color that I imagined she would be. And so but all of her heart tones, all of her, when they were checking her really regularly throughout the whole birth process. And so she had been fine and they weren't concerned about her at all. So, she colored up just fine initially. And then as they were doing the checking of her and watching her over the next hour or so, as they do, getting me cleaned up, got us to the bed, or weighing, I don't think they weighed her. I think they were just like
doing her newborn
suctioning for her. And then at some point they had to pull out an oxygen mask and start oxygen support for her because her oxygen saturations were dropping in the room. And so, we had tried latching. My younger sister is a IBCLC lactation consultant. international board certified. So she actually arrived very quickly and was helping me figure that part of it out, which our midwife could have done, but she's also, that's like her thing. She loves that. And so she was excited to be able to help me with that. So we did try some latching, but then it quickly became evident she was struggling with that because of the breathing piece. So our midwife kind of informed us at some point in, it seems like every time we take the mask off of her, our oxygen's dropping again. Like we put the oxygen on, she's maintaining, take it off, she's dropping. Like that's not normal for a full-term baby to be doing that. And so she was recommending, we need to get her to emergency care. You can go ahead.
So,
you want to add some things?
Well, so I remember her saying that we may need to bring her to emergency care. And it was actually a little bit later when I was holding her with the oxygen mask on her face, and her numbers started dropping while she had the oxygen mask on her face. And that's when it was like, okay, like I think there was some hope that eventually she'll kind of catch her breath. And I think we had her on
transitioning,
right?
Yeah, the outside world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think we actually were doing that for almost an hour of having the oxygen mask on her, and kind of as long as her numbers were high and fine with the oxygen mask on her. It was kind of a wait and see. It was a wait and see. But the moment that they started to drop while she had that mask on her, then that's when we called 911.
Yeah. So that part of it went really fast to me. I was a little bit focused on like trying to get the placenta out, and did I tear? Am I going to need stitches? I was still a little bit in my own world and kind of was missing. I think what they said was, it's super normal for babies when they're in this transition to maybe need a little bit of oxygen support. So I wasn't worried until she was like, okay, we need to transfer her to the hospital. I was like, what? Like, we're going to the hospital? Like, what happened? So it felt really surprising for me, that piece of it. I think it sounded like you had a little bit more
we had some
warning.
Gradual build up for that decision. Yeah, it wasn't a fast decision.
Yeah. And what she had told us in advance was, and what I had read was that midwives are allowed to provide oxygen support for a certain number of hours. And if they get to that point and the baby still needs that support, they can't just continue indefinitely to provide that support. That's
right.
Kind of
the baby needs to be evaluated in the hospital.
Right. Exactly. And she said, there's lots of times where we help for an hour and then baby doesn't need it anymore and they're fine and they go on. And so they have that in their tool belt, but it's not meant to be a longer term care. So yeah, we called 911, 1:30, 2 in the morning. No, at this point it was probably 3:30 in the morning. So we had an ambulance out in front of the street, fire department, like 4 dudes in the house after all of this female energy other than Nathan, like 4 dudes come in with me and this little tiny baby that they're going to be taking in. They allowed me to go in the ambulance with her. So I actually got to hold her in my arms on the way to the hospital, which was really helpful. I think it would have been really anxiety provoking
if they just took her away.
They had separated. Yeah. They had the awareness, or I don't know if the midwife said something or what, or maybe they were like, maybe this mom isn't actually okay and we need to take them both. The midwife was telling him everything. She's fine. Like there's nothing for her that should be a concern. But so I went with her in the ambulance and then you drove behind. Not behind.
So that they basically told me, do not try to keep up. Don't risk getting in an accident by staying behind. So told me where they were going and for me to get there in a safe and law-abiding manner. And so, yeah, I didn't drive behind you guys. Okay. I knew where to go, and they quickly left me. Going through red lights and all that stuff.
Middle of the night.
Yeah.
In the rain. So, and they were providing oxygen support during the transit to the hospital. And then once we got to the hospital, I think I was still under this idea that, and this was again part of what my midwife said, was maybe there's more going on. It's also possible that she's one of those babies that needs oxygen support for 24 hours and then she's going to be fine and you're going to be able to bring her home. And so I think I still was going into it with kind of with less anxiety than is typical of me. I was it was still the birth endorphins of like, she's here, she's fine, everything's going to be great. A little bit in denial maybe of what could be. So we got to the hospital, we went into the pediatric ER. And one of the things that looking back was a huge blessing. She was born right in the dip before Delta. Mm-hmm. So hospital rooms were not overwhelmed at this point. And so we were able to get in very quickly. They got us up there. She was, they did the evaluation with all of the nurses and doctors there. You came in around at this point as well. And yeah, they were very diligent, did all of the scans. They were able to say nothing wrong with her heart. And then kind of whisked her upstairs to the NICU. We spent 5 hours sitting in the lobby while she was being stabilized, which was definitely, I think for me, the hardest part, being separated from her and the uncertainty of like, how bad is this? What's going on? Like, I thought this was just like, she needs some oxygen support. And they were able to come out and say to us, like, we're basically ramping her up. Like, we started on just oxygen, then we did high flow oxygen, and then they ended up having to intubate her. And they did, regular flow intubation, and then they had to go to a high flow intubation where they had to sedate her, basically just trying to get her stable. And to this day, we still really don't know why. She was full term, everything else was fully developed, brain and heart, everything was great. It just, for some reason, her respiratory system was not activating the way we would expect. And so she needed a lot of care. So that was pretty hard. At the same time, another piece of this that's also really amazing is she was taken to the hospital where my sister was working at the time as a lactation consultant in that hospital. And she was on duty that day. So she actually came up while we were in that 5-hour waiting period and got us setting up with pumping stuff. So she was able to get me to start pumping to help protect my breast milk supply for Phoebe and start getting some of that what's the word?
The golden juice.
The golden juice.
The colostrum. Yeah.
The colostrum, yeah.
Like,
my colostrum
I haven't heard before.
Yeah. So, some of the colostrum. And so that was a big support that she was there, and she was able to even kind of check in. And so we had somebody in the hospital who had that personal connection with us, who was able to kind of help reassure us in a way, because breastfeeding was something that was really important to me. I wanted to be able to do that. And so, that was another big blessing for us to have that support. But it was pretty scary having doctors come, having a doctor come out and be like, you have to sign all these forms about resuscitation and about, waiving certain kinds of liability if certain bad things happen. And like, here's some of the things that could happen with intubation. And like, we're just like, do whatever you have to do to save our baby, right? Like, we thought she was healthy. We thought everything was fine. There was no indication that we were going to be in this situation. But here we were. So it was pretty tough.
Yeah, so something that the doctor said was that they did find some blood in her lungs, and they thought that maybe she got some blood in her lungs during the birthing pool process, which we asked the midwives later, was there any blood in the birthing pool? And they said, no, there wasn't any blood that we had noticed in the birthing pool. The doctor's was basically a shrug, and he said probably the birthing pool, but didn't really give much more other than that they found some blood in her lungs. The other bit, though, was they said that her lungs weren't really, they guessed maybe her lungs weren't fully developed, and so maybe her lungs needed some help, and they weren't, maybe that heart just for some reason hadn't developed fully in the womb period. So those are the two theories.
Well, there was one other thing, which was her lungs were still full of fluid, and she basically wasn't being able to cough up or expel the fluid, and so there wasn't enough oxygen getting in to fully oxygenate her body. Like, there was this usually a baby is born with fluid in the lungs because they're literally, soaking in that in utero, but they get it out on their own, and she wasn't. And so that had to kind of slowly diffuse through her body while they're providing enough oxygen support to keep her brain and everything else functioning the way they need to be. So that was the other thing I remember was when they did the scans on her lungs, they were like, it's all gray. It shouldn't be that color. Like it should be.
Yeah. So. And there are a certain percentage of newborns, about 1% of newborns will develop respiratory distress syndrome. So it's, something that can happen in a water birth or not a water birth. And I actually had the research pulled up today. I was preparing for a presentation. And in the latest study, which is the largest one to date on water birth by Bove-Bajorg et al. In 2022, and they really carefully matched more than 17,000 water births with 17,000 land births. And the newborn respiratory distress was 1.49% after a water birth and 1.61% after a land birth. So it can happen in either situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That was kind of what our midwife told us too. She was like, we didn't.
But I can see, there still is this misconception that water birth can cause it, and there can be rare case studies of things caused by the water birth, but from what you're saying, it sounds like it was maybe something else going on.
Yeah.
She was just having a really hard time transitioning to the outside world. And she was doing okay inside of you the whole time.
Right. Yeah. Right. She was fine as long as she had the umbilical cord connected. It was once we cut the cord
That's a good point,
that she started struggling.
That's a good point. I forgot about that. Yeah, we did an extended amount of time with the umbilical cord.
Right. We wanted to allow all of the cord blood for her to get all her cord blood back.
And we hadn't noticed any oxygen issues during that time.
Right.
That's a good point. It's good for parents to remember, like when there are respiratory issues, the longer you can keep that cord intact, until they get all their blood, that helps with their oxygen levels temporarily.
Yeah.
For sure. So she was in the NICU for about a week. How did that stay progress? You said it accelerated and they had to keep getting more aggressive. And then did they eventually start weaning her off of everything, or did that take a while?
Yeah. It felt really slow, but it was, we were in the NICU watching other families interact with their little ones, and there were other little ones that had been in there much longer than we were and who were still there when we were leaving. So, we understood that the scale of things for us might have felt slow, but it wasn't in terms of the grand scheme of many NICU families' experience. So she was off high flow within 48 hours.
Not high flow. Off fully high flow?
Off the high flow intubation. She was
right. That's high frequency intubation.
Oh, yeah. Within, I think, 24 hours, they had switched her from the more intense one where they had to have her sedated to the regular intubation where she was able to get and interact, open her eyes, and start to see us. We had some phenomenal nursing care. That we had a nurse who was super experienced and was pretty assertive in weaning her off of her care, basically like, she is a full-term baby. We're going to give her her best shot at getting out of here as fast as possible because I think she can do it. And so I think that was really reassuring for us to have a nurse who was, and it never felt like she wanted her out of there because there was another bed that some baby needed. Like the numbers were fine on that hospital wing. It was very much, she just had a belief that Phoebe could do it. And that was infectious and really helped us to feel more hopeful and to kind of be with her in that. We weren't able to breastfeed until maybe 3 or 4 days in, because eventually they did have the nasal cannula providing oxygen that way. And they had to get her off of her belly button.
Yeah, she had an intake tube for food.
But they were able to use my pumped milk and feed her that part of her care. That made a difference for us. Like, we felt like, okay, at least she's getting some of those good probiotics and antibodies and things like that aren't as readily accessible in what they're providing through there.
Yeah. There was kind of a mix of advocacy wins and losses as I kind of think of over the time. Most of the things that I thought went really well had to do with the nurse listening to us particularly well. So like, we wanted almost instantly, as soon as we could, to start doing, can't remember the name of it, but like the therapy where you just put a little bit of breast milk in their gums, even if they're not drinking it or whatever, but just putting some kind of, that was actually even before Priscilla was able to pump or had very much. We actually had some breast milk from her sister who she gave to us, and we put a little, or asked them to put a little bit in her gums.
We didn't use Mercy's.
What was that, hers?
No, it was all mine. It was what I was pumping.
Not the very first bit.
Really?
There was one day, the very first day, we wanted to get it in there. I know because it was white. It was white.
It was white, not gold.
Yeah, it was not. I remember asking the nurse, and the nurse was not asking any questions where it came from. Just say, please put this on our baby. And the nurse was really, really, receptive to that. The one thing that I think I was a little bit unhappy with, that I kind of asked the question with how like an advocacy loss, was removing the stomach tube or waiting as long as it was. It felt like everything was just like a timing thing, and there wasn't any times where I felt like we weren't getting the care we wanted, but it always felt like the timing wasn't. It was a little bit of a struggle for the timing, meaning they want to take as long as possible for everything. And so
she was in a teaching hospital, and so pretty much nothing really progressed until they did rounds in the morning. So even if she had been making progress, it was kind of waiting until everybody came through, all the doctors and all the residents, and everybody was there to kind of say, yes, we can move forward with this thing. Yeah. But they did a really good job of explaining things to us. Like, they didn't mind us sitting in on those kind of roundings as they were talking about Phoebe. And so we were able to ask some questions and get a sense for what was going on. And I think the EBB training that we got in self-advocacy was really helpful, because we kind of felt some permission to be like, we don't know what's going on. So why don't we ask? Like, why don't we, what are the pros and cons, and, how can we help?
Yeah, I think we advocated for letting Priscilla have breastfeeding
and skin to skin.
And skin to skin. And that took a little longer than I would have liked. I was a little bit dissatisfied with their excuse for how long to have the tube in, which was like, at one point I had the rumor around saying, she has a little stomach tube in, how long do we get that out? And says, well, she's healthy enough, we don't need it, but we like to finish the packet. Kind of thing. They're really expensive, and so we don't want to cut it halfway out because we can't give it to any other baby. And to me, I was like, that's 8 hours or 6 hours Priscilla can't do skin to skin. And so it felt like a big deal to me, but I think that was one of those things where I was like, okay, we don't need to fight on this. I can wait, some quantity of hours.
You gotta pick your battles sometimes.
Yeah, exactly.
But the fact that we were able to get that skin to skin, and it felt like it was actually a little bit of hassle for the nurses because they had, all the different wires and cables
Heart
and stuff.
monitors and oxygen monitors.
They had to kind of rearrange those things to allow Priscilla to do skin to skin and then to do nursing. And so it felt like that took a little bit of advocacy, but our staff was willing to do it because we were asking. And I think that was meaningful.
Yeah, I mean, it was obvious that in some ways, us being as present as we were and as in the room and, in some ways we were making it harder for them. But I think they really did a good job in terms of like convenience, their convenience. But they did a really good job of saying like, she needs to hear your voices and like, it's worthwhile for you to be here and you can talk to her and sing to her and touch her and, whatever. The nurses did that. And then they also had a social worker who came in and talked to us a little bit about the importance of us being present and real and having our real feelings in the room with her, that was part of what she needed for her neurological development. So yeah, I felt like we all had a really great team and felt really supported by our nursing care and felt like we were able to make good connections with them and ask for what we needed and recognize, oh, this is hard on them. And so, we're not going to push for,
The last kind of bit of advocacy I remember doing, it felt like it was kind of a high pressure situation, it wasn't high pressure, but it was when they were finally deciding if they were going to take her off oxygen or do a test to take her off oxygen. And I remember they were doing rounds. It was like the 7th day or something like that. And they were doing rounds and they came by and he was like, oh, how's she doing? Okay, she seems like she's doing all right. But maybe just to be safe, let's wait to do the test till tomorrow. And I asked, is there any harm in trying to do the test today? Is there any risks to that? And he's like, no, just want to be on the safe side.
We were so ready to take her home at this point.
Yeah, it was one of those things where I was like, could we consider doing a test today? And he kind of a long pause. All the students, had a bunch of students, they all like looked up at the teacher, and he says, all right, we'll try the test today. It was one of those times where it felt like because we were having kind of a back and forth exchange, and it wasn't a demand that he was willing to kind of say yes to. And she was able to go home that day, and that test was successful. But I felt like if I had not gone through EBB, I would absolutely not have asked those questions. My experience in the hospital setting was just say, yes, okay, whatever you want to do, we'll do that. And I didn't really understand that there was space and value in being able to kind of go back and forth. So that was one of those moments where I was like, wow, I'm really grateful I had gone through EBB to have the advocacy skills.
Oh, that's wonderful. It's like, I love it when people find that they can use their voices in all kinds of situations that maybe previously they would have felt like they didn't have the power or the status or the knowledge to use their voice. But like once you use it in that kind of situation, just think how valuable that is for the rest of your life, helping with elders or other family members or your children or your children's children. Like it really comes in handy to not be afraid to speak up.
Yeah. And to ask a question, like he said, he just asked, like, are there any risks if we try it today, right? Like, he wasn't like, you must discharge us today.
Consider trying it. And I like how, like, and then it made the doctor seem like generous and friendly by saying yes. So, because if he had said no, all the students would have been like, wow, he's kind of a jerk today. But yeah, you kind of gave them a chance to. The way you phrased it was perfect. Could we consider doing it today? Because then it's like you're saying you have the one to decide, and I'm asking you, and they get to look generous in front of everybody. I just love that. It's just human interaction, and I love doctors. My sister is a doctor, and we joke about it all the time. There's a little bit of an ego related to being a physician, so it's helpful when you're respectful and also not afraid to ask for things. So perfect. So were you sleeping at the hospital the whole time or did you go home to sleep?
Our NICU didn't allow you to spend the night there. So they basically kicked you out for 2 hours a day, but then in the evening you had to be awake. You weren't allowed to like sleep in the chair there.
Okay, you couldn't like snooze in the recliner or something.
I mean, maybe theoretically you could have, but that would have been like.
They asked us not to.
Yeah.
They said, please go home and come back in the morning.
Yeah.
They had pretty clear opening and closing hours. Like I think at like 6, they said, you can't be in this room at this time. You can come back for like 9 p.m. or some period of time like that.
Yeah, there was like an hour and a half every day that they would close for visiting hours. So we actually would go home at night and try to sleep. And they would give us updates in the morning when we came in, and we were there like as soon as the doors opened, and then there until almost, they kicked us out. That was really nice that we got that time with her, but it was really hard. Every time we left, like I cried. So it was just really hard to leave her behind. But I think there was a certain amount of like, we've done all we can, like, and we have to trust that her nurses are going to do a good job of taking care of her. It was unfortunate because I think the information we were getting when we came back in the morning was that she was more irritable and more distressed.
When you weren't
while
there.
we were not there. The first few nights they had to like provide some medication to help kind of soothe her. So that was unfortunate. Like we didn't love that. But at the same time, we also recognize like if she's getting really distressed and dysregulated, they have to do what they have to do. And I think they had OT come through and meet with us and then meet with the nurses and provide some suggestions for how to, and PT as well, some soothing suggestions for the nurses to help manage the difficult evenings when we weren't there. But I mean, they only have so much capacity, right? When they've got multiple babies, they've got to help to be able to soothe, hands-on soothing or massage or things like that. So, yeah.
And I think that's a good point, for NICU parents and parents in general to know there is research that supports rooming in for NICU babies. And I know some hospitals are starting to convert their NICUs to make that a possibility. And I hope that someday, it'll just be like how we don't send babies who are healthy to the nursery. A lot of hospitals, maybe someday, all the NICUs, you'll be able to stay with your baby overnight if you wish.
Yeah, I think that would have made a difference for her. And honestly, like our one kind of parenting challenge that persists with Phoebe, like she's super healthy, she's super verbal, like meeting all of her milestones, everything's really great, but sleep has been a real struggle. And part of me wonders if that first week of not having us around in the evenings contributed to that, like that if that was somehow a part of her was dysregulated in the evenings, and so it's taking her longer to meet those sleep milestones now because we're having to kind of repair some work in a way. So yeah, I hope that I would really encourage parents if they have the opportunity to stay overnight to try to make it work. But
it was also challenging though because you're still recovering from
absolutely.
It's not like,
and I had a long birth and I needed recovery.
Yeah, you needed some sleep, and probably sleep in a recliner in the hospital wouldn't be the best way to do that either. Yeah.
No, and it was COVID as well, and so only so many people were allowed to be on the list of people who could even come visit. So it wasn't like we could just tag team with another family member or something like that and say, hey, go up there over the evening. Like, it was just more challenging. Yeah. So.
What was it like bringing her home?
Such a relief. I think all of us slept so well that first night she was home because she was able to be with us. And it was interesting because I hadn't planned a homecoming for her because I had anticipated we'd have a home birth and she would just stay at home. And so it wasn't something we had thought about, but we were able to have some people who were able to be there and greet us, have food for us, and there were flowers and things like that. So it was really joyful to bring her home. I think I've heard from some parents that coming home with their infant after the hospital stay is like, oh my gosh, now it's real. We have to be parents. And for us, it was like, finally, we get to relax and just be with her, because we'd had a week of parenting at the hospital and trying to, him pushing me around in a wheelchair and parking and all of this stuff to try to manage the NICU stay. And so it was just a really big joy and relief to have her home.
Priscilla, before we go, are there any final words of advice you have for listeners who might be entering birth or parenting soon?
Yeah. If you have a partner, do your best to invest in that relationship so that you guys feel like you're a team going into it and coming through it. I can't imagine having done that NICU stay or the birth without Nathan. It made a huge difference to have his support. We read a book called Bringing Home Baby by Gottman, which both as an individual and as a psychologist, I would strongly recommend. And then another piece of it is, make sure you have a good support team, whether that's doula or family, lactation consulting. You don't necessarily know what curveballs your birth will throw you. And so having a good support system around you really, really matters. I credit the ability we've had to eventually breastfeed successfully to the support of my sister. Her name is Deborah Persine. So if anybody's local in San Antonio and you're needing lactation support, definitely look her up. So yeah, I think that was the biggest thing, was having that partnership piece.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So having a supportive birth partner and team of people you can call on for all the unexpected things that might come up. Yeah. Well, thank you, Priscilla and Nathan, for sharing your birth story. And, I think it's inspiring to hear how you were able to both use your voices throughout the process and make informed decisions along the way. And we're really thankful you came on here to share this with us today.
Yeah, thank you for giving us the opportunity to share. It was really meaningful to be able to tell our story and even kind of process some of the ups and downs of that journey.
This podcast episode was brought to you by the Evidence-Based Birth Childbirth Class. This is Rebecca speaking. When I walked into the hospital to have my first baby, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. Since then, I've met countless parents who felt that they too were unprepared for the birth process and navigating the healthcare system. The next time I had a baby, I learned that in order to have the most empowering birth possible, I needed to learn the evidence on childbirth practices. We are now offering the Evidence-Based Birth Childbirth Class totally online. In your class, you will work with an instructor who will skillfully mentor you and your partner in evidence-based care, comfort measures, and advocacy, so that you can both embrace your birth and parenting experiences with courage and confidence. Get empowered with an interactive online childbirth class you and your partner will love. Visit evidencebased birth.com/childbirth class to find your class now.